Funny story about that, Mr. Hut, sir. You see, I parked the Sandcrawler outside of a bar that I thought was on Tatooine, and it ended up being Toronto, and when I came back about 5 minutes later, it was gone. Oh, come on, there's no need to throw us into the Sarlacc pit or take our arms off. We can make you a new one. It's kind of our thing. You just need to give us a couple of moments. Hey everyone, and welcome to Groove Builders, the show where we create together. I'm your host, Disorderly Cone, and thanks for saving me there. In this episode, we're going to be building the Metal Earth Premium Series Sandcrawler and telling you everything you need to know to get it built. Like, what are the tricky bits? What tools do you need to build a Sandcrawler? And how does it actually all go together? These are great questions, and we're going to get the answers. Let's get down to the workbench and build this thing before tensions get any higher. And boom, just like that, we begin building the Metal Earth Premium Series Sandcrawler. And this happens to be one of the most detailed builds that we've done here on the show. And I know I've said that quite a lot. It seems we're almost escalating things one after the other. But don't worry, this is still a heavy build. And if you haven't built a whole lot of Metal Earth models, I highly recommend watching this video before attempting this guy. So let's get started with our instructions. These guys here have a ton of information for us to go over. Starting off with that little part there at the top. That part there shows us the fold lines, it shows us the tabs, and it shows us the insertion holes. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be bending all of our parts along those little lines. Some pieces have them in clear indicated, and other ones are kind of hard to figure out. But all of them we'll show you how to do in our longer build videos, which is the first 3 parts of this series. This one here is just a general overview. After we've bent our pieces, we need to connect the tabs into the insertion holes, and after we place them in there, we secure them with a twist or a bend. The way that those are indicated is with those circles and triangles. Another thing to pay attention to is those engraved and non-engraved symbols, indicated by the E and then the NE. Non-engraved. That will tell you what orientation the piece needs to be folded in. Sometimes you want the detail on the inside, and other times you want it on the outside where we can see it being placed onto the Sandcrawler. Finally, there's going to be red, yellow, and arrows throughout our instructions. The red shading means that we need to fold these particular areas. The yellow indicates that we need to curve the different spots. And finally, the arrows indicate what tabs need to be secured first before securing the other ones. This can come in handy when we're trying to get difficult parts in place, and I highly recommend following them, especially for some of the smaller detailed areas. All right, we've looked at our instructions. Let's get to our tools. The first tool that I'm going to recommend is a good pair of nippers. Nippers are super important for cutting out all of our pieces and making sure there's no leftover metal on them. If you find that there's leftover metal on your pieces, you're going to need to go back over and clean them up. That little bit of leftover metal can get in the way of our parts coming together and also make the model look a little less than it should. I know it's a Sandcrawler, kind of a salvage vehicle of sorts, but really you want it to look sharp and nice. So make sure that all of your pieces are properly cleaned cleaned up with a good pair of nippers. The next tool I'm going to recommend to you is a good pair of pliers. There they are, infinity pockets, sometimes hard to find things. Pliers are great for going through all of our pieces and shaping them. I've become really partial to these guys in the last year. They're really nice, they got smooth on the inside, come to a good point, allowing me to bend even some of the most smallest pieces here, and you'll definitely see me using these throughout this build. Another really interesting tool to use is a good pair of tweezers. Tweezers are great for not only grabbing our pieces, but also shaping them in different ways. Yes, you can use the points, but also the sides of them can be used to be able to shape some of our bigger pieces and get a really nice 90-degree bend. A good pair of tweezers is always great to have on hand. The next tool that I'm going to recommend is something that's a little bit different, but still very useful for a lot of the parts in here, and that is a dapping punch. Dapping punches are great because not only do we get a really nice 3D effect if we use this little ball here, but we can also take the sides here and get some really nice cylinder shapes. Now, personally, having different sizes really does come down to it. And if you don't have a mandrel set, or I should say dapping set, you can always use a mandrel like these. This has multiple different sizes here for us to be able to use. And again, having some tools like this definitely make those cylinders a lot easier. And finally, a tab bending tool. Now, this is a very unique piece of kit, but it has some really cool features. It has a cut on either end, allowing us to be able to grab our tabs and twist or bend them in any way that we like. It also has some shaping features like this little cone here at the top, or the cylinder shapes that we can get with the center here. Again, a very useful tool and one that can be found on Amazon. Links in the description down below. Now, these are just our recommendations, and you really don't need anything but nippers and tweezers to get the job done. But of course, having all of these extra tools will make your life a lot easier, especially with these detailed builds. All right, now we've looked at our instructions and we've talked tools. Let's get into our build. Starting off with the layered cake of our build. I call it the layered cake because we're putting a whole bunch of parts on top of each other, especially with part one here. Now, when it comes to our smaller pieces for the entirety of our Sandcrawler, you really want to take your time making sure that the edges match up nicely and that you have a good form before placing it onto the bigger pieces. The reason why I say this is that once they are in place, you might accidentally end up moving them around. And if you gotta make a small correction, that's okay, but big corrections become very difficult with some of the clustered details. Also, it's important to make sure that when we're taking our parts and putting them into part one or any of the other clustered areas of our Sandcrawler, that we're making sure that we put the tabs into the improper insertion hole. Nothing is worse than putting a thing in place, securing it, and then grabbing the next part and trying to put it in and it's not going in because there's no hole for that tab to go into place. This is a tricky bit, and because these pieces here are on the smaller side, the metal is a little bit weaker and it's very easy to break some of our pieces. So again, double check your work before securing any of your parts and everything should work out pretty good. Some interesting details here are definitely these little cap guys here. I gave them an interesting 3D effect by using my cake decorating tool and a dapping punch. You don't necessarily need to do this, but having this 3D effect here definitely adds a little bit of a pop. Not having this tool, you can get the similar effect by taking your tweezers or even pliers and just giving a little bit of bend while going in a circular rotation. While doing small little bends like this, you'll keep everything nice and uniform, and you might even get a better shaping than I did. Step 13, part 57. Now this is a little bit of a tricky piece. It starts out easy though. We just gotta bend those sides down 90 degrees, and then we're gonna bend the wires up, and then the second half down like this, creating a little staircase. The tricky part though comes into those 5 little cylinders that we have to shape. I should say half cylinders. I tried to use my mandrel, which worked kind of, but then I found that just using my pliers was really the best way to go. I achieved these little cylinders by making tiny little bends in each one, being careful not to overbend where they connect, because between that is a little perforated metal, and if we bend too much, they will break. Now mine didn't break, but I could definitely see how this could be a hard little bit here for some people, so I'm highlighting it here. If you're doing this piece, just take your time and maybe look at our videos to see how I achieved it, and you'll be able to get through it. Step 21, triangle time. With part 81, all we're doing is just matching up all the borders of our triangle to create a nice little crisp detail piece to go on to part 80. Where this gets a little bit tricky though is part 83. Part 83 is going to be this little border that we attach to the bottom of the Sandcrawler, and it has 2 little light pieces that can get in the way if we're not careful. And the whole thing is only attached by 1 tab. Yeah, it's a really weird little section of this build, and getting it right can be tricky. My first recommendation would go ahead and get the basic shape like I did here. And then instead of trying to shape the lights in place now, wait. Just bend them down a little bit so you can attach the piece onto the Sandcrawler first. Once the piece is attached to the Sandcrawler, we can go ahead and shape those lights into their proper area. But trying to do so beforehand just really didn't work out for me. So I highly recommend just waiting a little bit on the headlight part, get the whole thing installed first, and then bend them down to the proper place. You'll have a better looking thing than I did. Oh boy, we're in the home stretch, but we're still having to do the most labor-intensive part so far, the tracks. Everything that we do here has to be done 4 different times to create each track section. And getting it done right was a little tricky, so let's go ahead and get started with these little cylinder pieces. The best way to shape these guys is with a hand mandrel. We're gonna take the little part and then press them into the mandrel the best we possibly can. Then we're gonna pull them off, not capping them from the top just yet. We're gonna grab that little cap actually with our pliers or tweezers, and then we're going to insert it into that little backboard. Once the part is secured, then we'll go ahead and cap it and clean up the edges to make it look nice. This is the simplest way to get these parts into their proper place. We'll repeat this multiple times, and then once we have one half, we'll move on to actually putting the tracks on. Putting the tracks on was probably the most difficult part for me, and I say that not because it was tricky, but because I didn't notice that you had to put them on a certain way. You want the tabs facing the back half of the tracks. And the best way not to make the mistake like I did, where I had to pull the whole thing apart and basically rebuild all of these tracks, The best way to avoid that would just be to take your parts and lay them out ahead of time into the exact area where they're supposed to be going. And then that way, as you're building, if you see that the tabs are going to be facing the outside, you can go ahead and make the correction then, as opposed to building them all and then putting it on and realizing that half of them are the right way and the other half are the wrong way. It was a real pain in the butt, and I was very close to breaking some of my pieces. So I highly recommend double checking any of these pieces before going ahead and actually building them. It seems like I'm saying that a lot this build. And boom, there we have it, the Metal Earth Premium Series Jawa Sandcrawler in all of its glory. This build is quite big, isn't it? And a little heavy too. I would say that this is probably one of the better looking vehicles that we've seen from Metal Earth, especially on the Premium Series side, and kind of reminds me of the Y-Wing from back in the day. This build had a ton of detail, and the detail that was actually on here isn't too complicated to put together. But the sequence and how it goes together is. And I found myself making a couple of mistakes through this process, especially when we got to the repeated details. And I think it's because I was just kind of rushing through it. And with this build, you really can't do that. You need to take your time and double check the instructions as you're putting everything together to get the best possible Sandcrawler. Now, one thing I will say is these little tracks down here cost me a little bit of trouble. And that's because, again, the repeated detail on the instructions kind of tells you how to do it one way, and you go and you click them all together, and then you realize to make sure that all the tabs are on the inside of the Jawa Sandcrawler, these guys need to be orientated in the proper respect. And yeah, mine just weren't. So I had to take the whole thing apart, and that's the only time that I broke a tab, was when I had to take it all apart and then put it all back together. So don't be me, double check your work before putting anything together, and you should be fine. Outside of that, I did have a little bit of trouble here with the little border where all the little triangles are right here on the front. It's only held in with a couple of tabs, and making sure that everything looks just right is a little bit hard. So you're gonna have to take your time here too. There's not really a trick to it. It's just a matter of kind of working slow and not overbending any one particular part. Outside of that, this was a fantastic build, but I wouldn't recommend it for any new builder out there just because of the amount of detail that we're working with. I find that if a build has too much detail or the parts are too small, a new builder will look at it and go, too complicated, and then we'll lose them from the hobby. But for us builders out there that have a couple of builds under our belt, this guy here is perfect. It has tons of small details, tons of cool stuff for us to be able to form and connect together, and it's just what you're looking for. So I highly recommend this build for anyone with experience that's looking for a more intense and complicated build. This one is the one you're looking for, and you won't be disappointed. All right, Groovers, that brings us to the end of our episode. I had a really good time building the Jawa Sandcrawler with you, and if you guys had a good time, don't forget to press that like button. For more videos like this, hit subscribe as well, as we got all kinds of cool content coming out in the future, and I would love to have you there. Want to build your own Jawa Sandcrawler? Well, check out groovebuilders.ca. We have all kinds of great models on there, and soon we're going to be having a new update, so that's going to be kind of cool to check out. But all of our things are as cheap as they possibly can be, and we try to do shipping as fast as possible. Until next time, Groovers, keep building. Now I gotta hide this Jawa Sandcrawler. I don't want any of those little guys stealing it again.